Hello there, and welcome back to Nightfall Lore. Tonight we're descending into the Gothic streets of Yarnam, into a world where blood is currency, where churches prescribe plague as cure, and where the pursuit of enlightenment transforms men into monsters. We're going to explore the complete history of the healing church, an institution that promised salvation but delivered damnation, that offered healing but spread a plague worse than any disease. Before we begin our journey through these blood-soaked halls, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you drifting off in a cozy bedroom somewhere? Perhaps you're on a long drive through the darkness. Maybe you're somewhere in between sleep and waking, in that liminal space where the boundaries blur. Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the world you're resting in. It's always comforting to know there are others out there, fellow travellers through these dark tales. Now, settle in, get comfortable, pull your blankets close if you need to. Let the world outside fade into shadow. Because tonight's story is about an organisation that began with the noblest of intentions and ended as one of the most horrifying institutions ever conceived. It's about scholars who sought to elevate humanity and instead dragged it down into an abyss of teeth and claws. It's about the terrible price of playing God, of reaching for transcendence, of believing that the ends justify any means, no matter how monstrous. The healing church of Yarnam was not always a house of horrors. Once it was a beacon of hope in a world of suffering. People came from across the continent, drawn by tales of miraculous cures, of blood that could heal any ailment, of a place where the sick became whole and the dying found new life. They came with hope in their hearts and desperation in their eyes, and the church welcomed them all, gave them its special blood, its sacred ministration. And for a time it seemed like a genuine miracle. But miracles always have a price, and in Yarnam that price was paid in humanity itself. The blood that cured also corrupted. The treatment that healed also transformed. And slowly, inexorably, the streets of that Gothic city filled with things that had once been human. Creatures of fur and fang that prowled in the darkness, hunting their former kin with mindless hunger. This is the story of how it all began. How a group of scholars seeking knowledge awakened something that should have remained sleeping. How an institution built on healing became the source of the greatest plague the world had ever seen. How the shepherds became wolves and the flock became meat. The healing church stands as a monument to human ambition unchecked, to the dangers of seeking transcendence without wisdom, to what happens when those in power believe they know better than everyone else. Its towering cathedrals and grand architecture hide laboratories of torture. Its sacred rituals mask experiments of unspeakable cruelty. Its promises of salvation lead only to transformation into something that can no longer be called human. Tonight, we'll trace this institution from its origins in the halls of Byrgenwerth, through its rise to absolute power over Yarnam, through the various factions and philosophies that tore it apart from within, to its eventual collapse into nightmare and madness. We'll meet the men who built it, the monsters they became, and the countless victims ground beneath the wheels of their ambition. So dim the lights, close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you to Yarnam, to a city of blood and beasts, to the grand cathedrals of the healing church, where every prayer is a lie and every promise of salvation leads only to damnation. This is the complete history of one of the most terrifying institutions in all of fiction. Let us begin at the beginning, in a quiet college by a moonlit lake, where a group of scholars made a discovery that would doom them all. Chapter 1: The Bergenworth Foundation. Long before the healing church rose to power, before the streets of Yarnam ran red with blood and echoed with the howls of beasts, there was Byrgenwerth, a college of higher learning, isolated in the remote countryside far from any major city, built on the shores of a vast and mysterious lake. It was a place of quiet contemplation, of scholarly pursuit, of men and women who believed that knowledge was the path to elevating humanity beyond its current limitations. The master of this institution was a man named Willem, though he would later be known simply as Master Willem or Provost Willem. He was a scholar of the old school, believing that true transcendence came not through the body but through the mind. His philosophy centered on a concept he called insight, the idea that by expanding one's perception, by gaining more eyes on the inside, as he put it, humanity could ascend to a higher plane of existence. He taught his students to look inward, to seek enlightenment through contemplation and study. Many wore blindfolds as a symbolic gesture, turning their gaze away from the physical world to focus on the realm of thought and perception. Willem's most famous teaching, the one that would echo through the years and prove prophetic in the most terrible way, was a simple adage: fear the old blood. It was a warning, a cautionary principle that would be ignored by those who should have heeded it most. But to understand why Willem warned against the blood, we must first understand what Byrgenwerth discovered in the depths beneath their feet. You see, Byrgenwerth was not built in that remote location by accident. Beneath the college, beneath the lake, beneath the very earth itself, there existed something that scholars called the Chalice Dungeons, or the Ancient Labyrinths. These were ruins of a civilization that had existed long before any written history, built by beings called the Thumerians. The ruins stretched deep into the earth, layer upon layer of forgotten crypts and blood-soaked altars, guarded by things that were neither quite dead nor truly alive. Willem sent expeditions into these labyrinths. His best students descended into the dark with torches and notebooks, searching for knowledge, for artifacts, for any clue about the ancient civilization that had built these impossible structures. Many went mad down there in the endless tunnels, their minds breaking under the weight of truths too vast for human comprehension. Many never returned at all, lost forever in the twisting passages or torn apart by the things that lurked in the deeper levels. But those who did return brought back something extraordinary. Two things, actually, that would change the course of history. The first was knowledge of beings they called Great Ones, cosmic entities of immense power that existed on a plane beyond human understanding. These were not gods in any traditional sense, but rather alien intelligences so vast and strange that merely perceiving them could drive a person insane. The scholars learned that these Great Ones were intimately connected to the ancient Thumerian civilization, that the ruins beneath Byrgenwerth were in some sense temples or contact points for these cosmic beings. The second thing they discovered was blood. Old blood, they called it. Ancient blood from the Great Ones themselves or from creatures connected to them. Blood that possessed properties unlike anything in the natural world. Blood that could cure disease, heal wounds, grant strength and vitality beyond normal human limits. Blood that seemed miraculous in its effects, a literal elixir of life pulled from the veins of beings that might as well be gods. This discovery split the scholars of Byrgenwerth into two camps. On one side stood those who followed Willem's philosophy, believing that the path to transcendence lay in insight, in expanding the mind and perception. They looked at the old blood with suspicion and fear, understanding that something so powerful must come with a terrible price. Master Willem himself was the leader of this faction, along with a few loyal followers, including a woman named Rom, who would later play a crucial role in the church's history. On the other side stood those who saw the old blood as the key to everything they sought. If humanity wanted to transcend its limitations, to evolve beyond the fragile flesh that bound them, then this blood was the answer. By infusing themselves with the blood of the Great Ones, by literally making that divine essence part of their own bodies, they could achieve the ascension they all desired. This faction's most prominent member was a young scholar named Laurence, who would become perhaps the single most important and tragic figure in all of this dark history. Laurence was brilliant, charismatic, and absolutely convinced of his righteous purpose. He looked at the suffering in the world, at all the diseases and ailments that plagued humanity, and he saw in the old blood a solution. This wasn't just about personal transcendence for Laurence. He genuinely believed he could help people, that by distributing this miraculous blood he could end suffering on a massive scale. He saw himself as a saviour, as someone bringing light to a world of darkness. Willem tried to dissuade him. The old master knew that Laurence was his brightest student, perhaps the most promising scholar Byrgenwerth had ever produced. But he also understood that the path Laurence wanted to walk was paved with danger. The old blood was not merely a substance. It was connected to beings far beyond human comprehension, and using it would inevitably draw the attention of those cosmic entities. Willem had studied the ruins, had read what fragments of Thumerian texts could still be deciphered, and he knew that the ancient civilization had fallen because of the blood, transformed into something monstrous before sealing themselves away in the very crypts that Byrgenwerth scholars now explored. One of the other scholars at Bergenworth was named Caril, who possessed a unique gift. Caril could hear the sounds of the Great Ones and the creatures connected to them, and could transcribe those sounds into symbols called runes. These runes, when carved into the mind through some arcane process, could grant various powers and protections. One of Caril's earliest and most significant runes was called the Beast rune, transcribed from the howls of the creatures in the labyrinth. This rune enhanced physical power but also brought one closer to the state of beasthood. Its very existence suggested that there was something about the blood, about contact with the Great Ones, that pulled humans toward a more animalistic state. Master Willem pointed to this as evidence. The blood might heal, might grant strength, but it also came with a terrible side effect. It transformed people into beasts, into mindless animals driven only by hunger and rage. This was why the Thumerians had fallen. This was why their civilization lay in ruins beneath the earth. And this was why humanity must fear the old blood, must pursue enlightenment through insight, instead of through physical transformation. But Laurence wouldn't listen. He believed he could control it, could harness the blood's power while avoiding its dangers. He thought that with proper study, with careful application, he could give humanity all the benefits of the blood without the bestial curse. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong, but by the time anyone realized it, the damage was already done. The split between Willem and Laurence was not merely philosophical, It was personal, painful, the breaking of a bond between master and student that had been years in the making. When Laurence finally announced that he was leaving Byrgenwerth to pursue his work with the blood, Willem felt betrayed. Here was his most promising pupil, the one he had hoped would carry on his life's work, abandoning everything they had built together to chase after power disguised as altruism. There's a memory, preserved somehow in Laurence's own skull after his death, that captures this moment. Willem sits in his chair by the lakeside, speaking to Laurence one final time. "You think now to betray me," the old master says, his voice heavy with sorrow and resignation. Laurence tries to reassure him, "No, but you will never listen. I tell you, I will not forget our adage." He promises that even as he works with the blood, he will remember Willem's warning. He will fear the old blood even as he uses it. But both of them know this is hollow comfort. If Laurence truly feared the blood, he wouldn't be leaving to work with it. When Laurence departed Byrgenwerth, he didn't go alone. Several other scholars joined him, convinced by his vision or simply unable to resist the lure of the old blood's potential. Among them was a man named Micolash, who would later found the School of Mensis and become the host of a terrible nightmare. There was also Gehrman, though his exact relationship to Byrgenwerth is less clear. He may have been a scholar there, or he may have been a hunter who worked with them, protecting the expeditions into the labyrinth. Either way, he knew both Willem and Laurence well enough to call out to them in his dreams, begging them to free him from a fate we'll discuss later. These scholars left the quiet shores of that moonlit lake and travelled to the city of Yharnam. They brought with them samples of the old blood, notebooks filled with their research, and an unshakable conviction that they were about to change the world. And they were right, just not in the way they imagined. Back at Byrgenwerth, Master Willem continued his research into insight and the Great Ones. He conducted experiments of his own, terrible in their own way, trying to force his students' minds to expand, to grow eyes on the inside that would let them perceive higher truths. Many of these experiments failed, leaving the subjects as little more than vegetables with oversized heads, shuffling through the halls of the college with vacant stares. But Willem pressed on, convinced that his path was the right one, that transcendence through perception was possible, if only they pushed hard enough. One experiment appeared to succeed, though whether this was truly success or simply a different kind of failure remains unclear. Rom, one of Willem's most devoted students, underwent some kind of transformation that elevated her to the status of Great One. She became Rom, the vacuous spider, a being of immense power but seemingly no intelligence whatsoever, hiding in the depths of the Moonside Lake. Whether she lost her humanity in the transformation, or whether this simplified, almost childlike state was necessary to exist as a Great One, we may never know. But Willem kept her there, in the lake, using her somehow to hide truths from the world, to keep certain realities veiled from human perception. As the years passed, Byrgenwerth fell into ruin and isolation. Most of its scholars had left with Laurence. Those who remained were either devoted to Willem's vision or had been broken by the experiments conducted there. The once great institution became little more than a lonely building by a lake, presided over by an old man in a rocking chair who could no longer speak, who could only point toward the lake where his most successful experiment hid herself in spider form, keeping secrets that maybe should have stayed hidden forever. But the legacy of Byrgenwerth lived on in Yarnam. The scholars who left those halls carried with them the knowledge and the blood that would shape the future of that city and doom most of its inhabitants. They would found an institution that dwarfed Byrgenwerth in size and influence, that would come to rule not just a college but an entire city. They would call it the Healing Church, and for a time it seemed like Laurence's dream might actually come true for a time. Chapter 2: The Great Schism. The journey from Bergenworth to Yarnam was not merely a physical one, it represented a complete break with the old ways, a rejection of Willem's cautious philosophy in favour of something bolder, more ambitious, and infinitely more dangerous. When Laurence and his followers arrived in the city, they didn't come as scholars seeking a place to continue their research in peace. They came as prophets, as bearers of a miracle, as men who had found the answer to humanity's oldest prayers. Yarnam was, even then, a city of significant size and influence. Its Gothic architecture reached toward the sky in spires and towers, its streets were cobbled and ancient, and its people were no strangers to hardship. Disease was rampant, as it was everywhere in that era. The poor died young from ailments that had plagued humanity since time immemorial. The rich lived longer, but not necessarily better. Their wealth, unable to buy genuine health, only delay the inevitable, decline into sickness and death. Into this world of suffering came Laurence with his miracle cure. He offered the people of Yarnam something they had never had before: blood ministration. It was a simple concept, almost elegant in its straightforwardness. You were sick, so you received a transfusion of the special blood he had brought from the labyrinths beneath Byrgenwerth. The blood would cure your illness, would heal your injuries, would make you stronger and healthier than you had ever been before. All you had to do was accept this gift, this communion through blood. At first, the people of Yarnam were skeptical. They were a somewhat xenophobic population, suspicious of outsiders and their strange claims. Some crazy man from the countryside wanted them to drink blood because it would make them healthy. It sounded like madness, or worse, like some kind of cult ritual. The citizens were not easily swayed by empty promises, especially not promises involving something as viscerally disturbing as consuming blood. But Laurence was not offering empty promises. The blood actually worked. Those who were sick and agreed to the treatment found their ailments cured within days. People who had been dying suddenly found themselves vibrant and healthy again. The blind could see, the lame could walk. Chronic pain vanished as if it had never existed. It was, in every observable way, a genuine miracle. Word spread quickly. As more people witnessed the effects of blood ministration, more were willing to try it themselves, and as more tried it, more became convinced of its efficacy. The scholars who had come with Laurence began to organize, to create a structure around the distribution of this miraculous treatment. They couldn't just hand out blood to anyone who asked. They needed to maintain some control, to present themselves as something more than simple distributors of medicine. And so, the Healing Church was born. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually as the organization around blood ministration grew and formalized. Laurence became its first vicar, the spiritual and administrative head of this new institution. Other scholars took positions of authority as well. The church established itself in Yarnam's Grand Cathedral, a massive Gothic structure that dominated the city skyline. From there, they would oversee the distribution of blood, the treatment of the sick, and the gradual transformation of Yarnam into something new. The church's doctrine was built on the foundation of the old blood. Blood was sacred, blood was life, blood was the path to transcendence. They didn't hide the blood's connection to the Great Ones, not entirely. In fact, they incorporated that cosmic element into their theology, positioning the Great Ones as divine beings worthy of worship and study. The Church presented itself as an intermediary between humanity and these cosmic gods, as the institution that could safely shepherd people toward ascension. They adopted many elements from Willem's teachings, despite having rejected his core philosophy. Church hunters and high-ranking members wore variations of student uniforms inspired by Byrgenwerth attire. They even adopted Willem's practice of wearing blindfolds, though they reinterpreted its meaning. For the Church, the blindfold was about looking inward to find truth, about shutting out distractions to focus on the spiritual. They took Willem's methods while abandoning his principles, a kind of philosophical grave robbing that the old master, sitting alone by his lake, could do nothing to prevent. The early days of the healing church must have felt like a golden age. The blood worked exactly as promised. People who had suffered for years found relief. The church gained followers not through coercion but through genuine gratitude. They established blood ministration as a common practice throughout Yarnam, and their influence grew with every person healed, but there were costs that weren't immediately obvious. The blood was addictive, for one thing. People who had been healed found themselves craving more treatments, even when they were no longer sick. There was something in the blood that called to them, that made them feel incomplete without it. The euphoria it provided, that rush of vitality and strength, became something they needed rather than simply wanted. The church didn't discourage this addiction. In fact, they may have encouraged it, understanding that dependence on blood meant dependence on the church itself. There were also whispers of side effects that the church didn't discuss openly. Some people who received blood ministration began to change in subtle ways. They became more aggressive, more prone to violence. Their appetites grew, particularly for meat. They developed enhanced senses, especially smell. Their teeth seemed sharper, their nails more claw-like. These changes were gradual enough that most people didn't notice them or dismissed them as natural variations. But they were there, building up slowly, like a disease with a very long incubation period. The relationship between the healing church and Byrgenwerth during this time was complex and strained. Willem had not forbidden his former students from returning to the college. Members of the church, particularly those in the highest echelons, would occasionally visit Byrgenwerth to consult the old master, or to access the research materials still kept there. But these visits were tinged with sadness and regret on both sides. Willem saw his fears being realized but was powerless to stop it. The church scholars saw their old master as a relic of outdated thinking, someone who couldn't recognize progress when it stared him in the face. One group within the church maintained a particularly close connection to Byrgenwerth. This was the choir, an elite faction we'll discuss in more depth later. They wore uniforms that closely mimicked Byrgenwerth student attire and studied the works of Master Willem with an almost religious devotion. The choir saw themselves as the true inheritors of Byrgenwerth's legacy, combining Willem's pursuit of cosmic truth with the church's use of the old blood. They were, in their own minds, synthesizing the best of both philosophies. But synthesis is not the same as wisdom, and the choir's experiments would prove just as terrible as anything the church did in the name of healing. As the healing church established itself as the dominant institution in Yarnam, as it grew in power and influence, the seeds of its downfall were already germinating. The blood that cured also corrupted. The ministration that healed also transformed. And somewhere in the depths beneath Yarnam, in the endless labyrinths where the blood had been discovered, ancient things stirred in their sleep, drawn by the massive amounts of old blood being transfused into thousands upon thousands of human bodies. The stage was set. The church had risen to power. Laurence had achieved his dream of bringing the blood's benefits to the world. All that remained was to discover the price that would have to be paid and who would be forced to pay it. That discovery would come soon enough, and it would transform Yarnam from a city of hope into a city of horror, where the streets ran red with blood and the screams of the transforming echoed through the night. The Great Schism had ended. Laurence's church had won, but in winning, they had doomed themselves and everyone who had put their faith in them. The question was no longer whether disaster would strike, but when, and whether anyone would survive to remember what the city had been before the blood changed everything. Chapter 3: Blood Ministration. To understand how the healing church rose to absolute power over Yarnam, you must first understand what blood ministration meant in practical terms. This wasn't simply medicine in the way we think of it. It was a complete transformation of the city's relationship with health, with suffering, with the very concept of mortality itself. Before the church arrived, Yarnam was like any other city of its era. Disease was accepted as part of life. People got sick, and sometimes they got better, and sometimes they died. There were doctors, of course, but their treatments were often as dangerous as the diseases they tried to cure. Bloodletting, mercury treatments, various herbs and tinctures that might help or might make things worse. Medicine was as much art as science, and the art was often brutal. The healing church changed all of that overnight. Their method was revolutionary in its simplicity. You came to the church in need. They assessed your condition. Then, in a ritual that combined medical procedure with religious ceremony, they administered the blood. It wasn't a single dose that would last forever. The treatment needed to be repeated, sometimes once, sometimes multiple times, depending on the severity of the condition. But the results were undeniable and immediate. Testimonies from those early days must have been overwhelming. Imagine a woman who had been crippled by arthritis for decades, unable to work, barely able to care for herself, suddenly finding all her pain gone, her joints moving freely again. Imagine a child dying of consumption suddenly breathing clearly. The terrible coughing fits that had defined their existence simply stopping. Imagine a man going blind, feeling his vision return, the world coming back into focus after months or years of increasing darkness. These weren't subtle improvements. They weren't placebo effects or natural recoveries that would have happened anyway. The blood worked with a speed and completeness that defied any natural explanation. It was, in the truest sense of the word, miraculous. And the church positioned themselves as the source of these miracles, the only ones who could provide this incredible treatment. As word of these miracles spread, Yarnam transformed from just another city into a destination. People came from across the continent, drawn by stories of the healing blood. The sick, the dying, the desperate, they all made their way to Yharnam hoping to receive the church's ministration. The city's population swelled with pilgrims and seekers, all of them looking for the same thing: salvation from suffering through blood. The church welcomed them all. They established clinics throughout the city where blood ministration could be administered. They trained doctors in the proper techniques, men and women dressed in white who became known as blood ministers. These blood ministers were taught that medicine was not merely a means of treatment, but a method of research. Every patient who received the blood was in some sense an experiment, a data point that could help the church understand the blood's properties better. This experimental approach was hidden behind a veneer of compassion and spiritual guidance. The church presented itself as a benevolent organisation, motivated purely by the desire to help others. They charged money for their services, of course, but not exorbitant amounts. They wanted the blood to be accessible to all classes, understanding that widespread use would cement their power over the city more effectively than exclusivity ever could. The process of blood ministration itself was ritualized, given spiritual significance beyond its medical function. Patients would come to the church, often entering through the grand cathedral that served as the institution's heart. They would confess their ailments, their sins, their fears. They would pray either to the great ones or to more traditional concepts of divinity that the church deliberately left vague in their theology. Then they would receive the blood, administered by a blood minister who recited prayers and invocations as they worked. This ritualization served multiple purposes. It made the treatment feel sacred, special, something more than just medical intervention. It created a bond between patient and church that went beyond the transactional. People weren't just being cured of their diseases, they were being initiated into something, becoming part of a grand communion through blood. They were, in the church's terminology, taking communion with the old blood, becoming one with the divine substance that flowed from the great ones themselves. The addiction that developed was both physical and psychological. The physical addiction came from the blood itself, from whatever properties it possessed that made the body crave more of it. But the psychological addiction was perhaps even stronger. People who'd been healed by the blood felt gratitude, certainly, but also a kind of dependence that went beyond mere gratitude. They felt connected to the church in a way that was almost spiritual. They'd been touched by something sacred, had felt the power of the great ones flowing through their veins, and that experience changed them on a fundamental level. The church encouraged this dependence. They created a culture around blood ministration, a whole social structure that revolved around the blood. There were different grades of blood for different purposes. There were rituals for different occasions. There were hierarchies among those who had received the blood, with those who had undergone more ministrations or who had received rarer varieties of blood occupying higher social positions. But beneath all this spiritual language, beneath all the rituals and hierarchies and grateful testimonies, something terrible was happening. The blood was having effects that the church either didn't understand or chose not to acknowledge publicly. Those subtle changes we mentioned earlier, the increased aggression, the sharpening of features, the growing appetite for meat, they were becoming more pronounced in some people. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough that patterns were emerging if anyone cared to look closely. The church's own members were among the most heavily transfused. The blood ministers, the clerics, the hunters who protected the church's interests, they all received regular doses of the old blood. It was seen as necessary for their work, a way to strengthen them so they could better serve the institution and its mission. But this meant that those closest to the church, those most devoted to its cause, were also most at risk for whatever side effects the blood might cause. And those side effects, when they finally manifested in their full horror, would be catastrophic. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, In these early days, the healing church seemed to be fulfilling Laurence's vision perfectly. They were helping people, genuinely helping them, easing suffering on a massive scale. The city of Yarnam thrived under their guidance. Wealth flowed in from the pilgrims and patients. Architecture flourished as the church commissioned grand new buildings to accommodate all the people seeking treatment. Culture bloomed as artists and scholars were drawn to this city where miracles happened daily. Laurence must have felt vindicated. He had defied his master, had rejected the cautious approach that would have left all these people to suffer, and he had been proven right. The blood worked. People were being helped. His church was spreading good throughout the world, one ministration at a time. If there were warning signs, if there were hints that something was going terribly wrong beneath the surface, he either didn't see them or chose to believe they were manageable challenges rather than harbingers of doom. Master Willem, sitting by his laket by Byrgenwerth, must have watched all of this with growing dread. His former student was succeeding exactly as he had feared. The blood was being distributed widely, being pumped into thousands of bodies, transforming the population of an entire city into something new, and that transformation would not stop with cured diseases and enhanced vitality. It would continue, would accelerate, would push those people toward a fate that the Thumerians had suffered long ago in the depths of the earth. The old blood called to something in the human psyche, in the human body, something primal and terrible. It awakened instincts that civilization had spent millennia suppressing. It stripped away the veneer of humanity that separated people from animals, and slowly, inexorably, it began to transform those who received it into something that was neither quite human nor quite beast, but a horrible fusion of both, and slowly, inexorably, it began to transform those who received it into something that was neither quite human nor quite beast, but a horrible fusion of both. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took years, maybe decades, for the full effects to become apparent, and by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already far too late to stop it. The blood had spread too far, infected too many. The entire city, perhaps the entire region, had been transformed into a breeding ground for something monstrous. And the institution that had caused this catastrophe, the healing church itself, would prove utterly unprepared to deal with the consequences of what they had done. But before we explore those consequences, before we discuss the scourge of beasts that would consume Yarnam, we need to understand another element of the church's rise to power, because the blood alone, miraculous as it was, might not have been enough to give the church absolute dominance over the city. For that, they needed leverage, a crisis that would make the people of Yarnam dependent on them not just for healing but for survival itself. And so the church, whether through deliberate action or simply through callous exploitation of opportunity, helped create one of the darkest chapters in Yarnam's history. They created, or at least encouraged, a plague. Chapter 4. The Ashen Blood Conspiracy. In the district of Yarnam known as Old Yarnam, something terrible happened that would cement the healing church's power over the city permanently. A plague broke out, a mysterious illness that came to be known as Ashen Blood. It spread rapidly through the lower districts, affecting primarily the poor and working class who lived in the cramped, poorly ventilated buildings that characterized Old Yarnam's architecture. The symptoms of Ashen Blood were horrific. Victims would cough up grey, ash-like substance, their lungs slowly filling with this mysterious matter until they could no longer breathe. The disease was painful, lingering, and seemingly incurable by any traditional means, it devastated the population of Old Yarnam, killing hundreds, maybe thousands, and showing no signs of stopping. Into this crisis stepped the healing church with their miracle cure. Blood ministration, they claimed, could cure ashen blood just as it could cure any other ailment. And they were right, or at least they seemed to be right. Those who received the blood found their symptoms clearing, found themselves able to breathe again, found the terrible cough subsiding. Once again, the church appeared as saviours, as the only force standing between the people of Yarnam and total destruction. But there were dark whispers even then, rumours that some refused to believe, but that kept circulating nonetheless. Some claimed the healing church itself had caused the Ashen Blood plague, that they had deliberately released it to create dependence on their blood ministration. Others suggested that even if the church hadn't created the disease, they had at least delayed treating it, letting it spread until the population was desperate enough to accept any solution, no matter how strange. The truth is murky, buried under layers of church propaganda and the chaos of the crisis itself. But there are hints, fragments of evidence that suggest the conspiracy. Theorists weren't entirely wrong. There are references to experiments in Old Yarnam, to research into diseases and their interaction with the old blood. There are suggestions that the church was studying how blood ministration affected different ailments, and that this research may have gotten out of control or been deliberately weaponized. One particularly damning piece of evidence comes from a powder keg hunter named Jura, who would later guard the entrance to Old Yarnam, preventing anyone from entering. Jura had been there during the outbreak and its aftermath, and he knew things he refused to speak about, dark secrets about what really happened in those plague-stricken streets. His refusal to let anyone into Old Yharnam wasn't just about protecting the living from the beast that now inhabited those ruins. It was about keeping the truth buried, about making sure no one would discover evidence of what the church had done, whether the church created the Ashen Blood plague or simply exploited it matters less than what happened next. Because the church's response to the crisis, while appearing benevolent on the surface, had a darker purpose beneath. They distributed blood ministration to the afflicted, yes, but they also studied the effects carefully. They documented every case, tracked every patient, turned the entire disaster into one massive experiment. The people of Old Yarnam weren't just being saved, they were being used. And then, when the immediate crisis had passed, when most of those afflicted had either died or been cured through blood ministration, the church's next action revealed the true depths of their ruthlessness, because some of those who had been cured began to transform. The blood ministration that had saved them from Ashen Blood had also infected them with something else, something that turned them into beasts. The transformation happened more quickly in those who'd received massive doses of blood to combat the plague. Within weeks or months, some of the cured began to show signs of beasthood. They grew fur, their features distorted, their minds deteriorated. They became violent, aggressive, attacking their neighbours and family members. Old Yarnam, which had just survived one plague, found itself facing another one, this time of a very different nature. The healing church's response was swift and brutal. They declared Old Yharnam contaminated, a threat that needed to be eliminated completely, and then, in an act of unthinkable cruelty, disguised as necessary quarantine measures, they burned it. The church's hunters, along with others who served the institution's interests, set fire to Old Yarnam, turning the entire district into a massive pyre. The official story was that this was necessary to contain the beast plague, to prevent it from spreading to other parts of Yarnam, and perhaps that was even partially true. The transformation into beasts was clearly contagious in some sense, and left unchecked it might have spread throughout the city. But the speed and thoroughness of the church's response suggests something else as well. They were destroying evidence, burning away any trace of what they had done, of how their blood ministration had contributed to or caused the very transformation they were now using fire to combat. Thousands died in the flames, not just the beast that some had become, but all the normal people who still lived in old Yarnam, who had survived both the Ashen Blood plague and the initial wave of transformations. Men, women, children, entire families were burned alive in their homes because the church decided their district was too contaminated to save. The screams that rose from old Yharnam that night must have echoed throughout the city, a symphony of agony that Yarnam's citizens tried desperately to forget. But some never did forget. Jura, the powder keg hunter we mentioned earlier, was so horrified by what he witnessed that he turned against the church and his fellow hunters. He returned to the ruins of old Yarnam and stationed himself there, determined to prevent anyone else from entering, from disturbing the dead or uncovering the truth of what happened. He built automated gun turrets throughout the ruins, created a fortress out of the very ashes of the district he had helped destroy, and spent the rest of his life in self-imposed exile, guarding the graveyard of his conscience. The burning of old Yharnam served multiple purposes for the church. It eliminated a problem before it could spread too widely. It demonstrated their power and their willingness to take decisive action, no matter how brutal, when they deemed it necessary. It terrified the population of Yarnam into compliance, made them grateful that their own districts hadn't been burned, made them more willing to follow the church's edict without question. And perhaps most importantly, it established the precedent that beast transformation was a threat that required extreme measures to combat, because the beasts weren't going away. Old Yarnam had been the first major outbreak, but it wouldn't be the last. The blood that the church had distributed so widely that they had transfused into thousands upon thousands of people was slowly transforming significant portions of the population into monsters. The process was gradual, taking years or decades in most cases, but it was inexorable. Once you'd received the blood, once it was part of your system, the transformation was only a matter of time. The church couldn't burn every district that showed signs of beast transformation. They couldn't kill their entire congregation, so instead they adapted. They institutionalized the problem, created systems and structures to manage it, transformed the nightmare they'd created into something they could control, or at least appear to control. This is where the healing church's true genius revealed itself, not in their medical knowledge or their spiritual teachings, but in their ability to maintain power even as the foundation beneath that power crumbled into horror and madness. They created the Night of the Hunt, a regular occurrence where the beasts that prowled the streets were hunted down and killed. They established groups of hunters whose sole purpose was to track and eliminate those who had transformed. They built enormous institutions to contain or eliminate those showing signs of transformation. They turned the entire city into a machine designed to process the consequences of their own actions, a perpetual cycle of infection, transformation, and elimination that would continue as long as the blood kept flowing. And through all of this, the healing church maintained its position of authority. They convinced the people of Yarnam that they were the solution to the beast plague. when in reality they were its cause. They positioned themselves as protectors when they should have been condemned as murderers. They transformed their greatest failure into their strongest justification for continued power, using the very crisis they had created as proof that the city needed them more than ever. The Ashen Blood conspiracy, whether it was an actual conspiracy or simply opportunistic exploitation of a natural disaster, revealed the true nature of the healing church. They were not healers, they were not saviours, they were an institution that would do anything, sacrifice anyone, burn any number of innocent people alive, if it meant maintaining their grip on power and advancing their research into the old blood and the great ones. Laurence, if he ever felt guilt about what happened in old Yarnam, never showed it publicly. He continued his work, continued distributing the blood, continued the research that he believed would lead to humanity's transcendence. If he lost sleep over the screams of those burning alive in the district his church had condemned, if he questioned whether Master Willem had been right after all, those doubts remained private, hidden behind the facade of the confident first vicar leading his church toward a glorious future. But the seeds of his own destruction had already been planted, were growing in his own body even as he oversaw the church's continued expansion. Because Laurence had received more blood ministration than almost anyone, had infused himself with the old blood more thoroughly than any of his followers, believing that his devotion and understanding would protect him from its corrupting effects. He was wrong. The blood didn't care about intentions or understanding. It transformed everyone it touched eventually. Even the first vicar of the healing church, even the man who had brought this miracle to Yarnam, was not immune to the beast that slumbered in the blood, waiting to emerge. Chapter 5. The First Hunters and Ludwig's Legacy. To understand how the healing church consolidated its power and managed the crisis it had created, we must understand the hunters. These figures, dressed in dark coats and wide-brimmed hats, carrying weapons that seemed too large and brutal to be practical, became the church's enforcers, its exterminators, its public face of protection against the scourge of beasts. But the history of the hunters is more complex than it first appears, involving two different workshops, two different philosophies, and one man whose legacy would define what it meant to be a church hunter. The first workshop, the one that predates the healing church's direct involvement in hunting, was established by Gehrman. Whether Gehrman was originally a scholar of Byrgenwerth or simply someone associated with that institution remains unclear, but he was definitely connected to the early research into the old blood and the labyrinths beneath. At some point, possibly, during those early expeditions into the Chalice dungeons, Gehrman learned to hunt, not animals, but something else, things that lurked in the dark beneath the earth, creatures that were neither alive nor dead in any traditional sense. Gehrman brought this skill back to the surface and established what would become known as the First Hunters' Workshop. It was located in a building that would later be sealed away, accessible only through obscure paths that most of Yharnam's citizens had forgotten existed. In this workshop, Gehrman trained others in the art of hunting, teaching them how to track dangerous prey, how to move through darkness and chaos without losing themselves, how to kill things that shouldn't be able to be killed. The weapons Gehrman created or popularized were unique, designed specifically for hunting things that were stronger and faster than humans. Trick weapons, they were called, because they could transform between different modes, adapting to different combat situations. The saw cleaver could switch between a compact cleaver and an extended saw. The hunter axe could transform from one-handed to two-handed modes. The threaded cane, deceptively elegant, could extend into a serrated whip. These weapons were brutal, practical, designed by someone who understood that hunting monsters required tools as monstrous as the prey itself. Gehrman's philosophy of hunting was pragmatic and somewhat melancholy. He understood that hunting was necessary, but he didn't romanticize it or pretend it was glorious. Hunters were killers, necessary killers perhaps, but killers nonetheless. They waded through blood and death. They ended lives that had once been human, and this work took a toll on the soul that no amount of skill or training could prevent. Gehrman knew this because he lived it, because he had lost so much to the hunt, including people he cared about deeply. One of those people was a woman named Maria, who became one of Gehrman's most skilled students. Maria was connected to Cainhurst, a castle of nobles who dabbled in blood arts that the church considered heretical. She came to Gehrman's workshop and learned to hunt with a skill that rivaled the master himself. But eventually, Maria became disillusioned with hunting, with the constant killing, with something terrible that happened in a place called the Fishing Hamlet that we'll discuss later. She threw her beloved weapon down a well and left Gehrman's workshop, severing all ties with hunting and the church. Years later, she would be found dead, though whether by her own hand or through other means remains unclear. When the healing church rose to power, they initially relied on Gehrman's hunters to deal with the beast problem. But as the situation escalated, as more and more people transformed, and the need for hunters grew exponentially, the church decided to establish their own workshop, directly under their control. This was the Healing Church Workshop, and it represented a fundamental shift in the philosophy and practice of hunting. Where Gehrman's hunters were skilled individuals, almost artists in their deadly craft, the church workshop mass-produced hunters. They recruited widely, trained quickly, and deployed in large numbers. The church had resources that Gehrman could never match, and they used those resources to create an army of hunters who could sweep through the streets of Yarnam during the night of the hunt, eliminating beasts with brutal efficiency. But the church workshop needed someone to lead it, someone who could give these mass-produced hunters a sense of purpose and honour, who could transform what was essentially institutionalized slaughter into something that seemed heroic. They found that someone in Ludwig, a man who would become perhaps the most beloved and tragic figure in the Healing Church's history. Ludwig was not a scholar or a theologian. He was a warrior, someone who believed deeply in the concept of honour and righteousness. When he learned about the beast plague afflicting Yarnam, he saw not a political problem or a research opportunity, but a genuine threat to innocent people that needed to be stopped. He joined the Healing Church with pure intentions, believing that by hunting beasts he could protect the helpless and bring order to chaos. The church recognized Ludwig's value immediately. Here was someone who could give hunting a noble face, who could make it seem like holy work rather than necessary butchery. They promoted him rapidly, eventually naming him the first hunter of the church, the head of the church workshop, and the model all other church hunters should emulate. Ludwig brought revolutionary changes to how hunting was practiced. He introduced the concept of honour to the hunt, created codes of conduct that church hunters were expected to follow. He designed new weapons, most famously the Holy Moonlight Sword, a blade that seemed to glow with inner light and became a symbol of everything the church wanted hunting to represent. This wasn't just killing. This was righteous work, holy work, work done in service of protecting humanity from a terrible threat. Under Ludwig's leadership, the church workshop flourished. Hundreds of hunters were trained and deployed. They wore uniforms that looked less like the practical gear of Gehrman's workshop and more like armour, decorated with religious symbols and the emblem of the church. They carried themselves not as hired killers, but as knights, protectors of the faith, defenders of civilization against the beast threat. Ludwig genuinely believed in what he was doing. He saw the gratitude in people's eyes when hunters cleared their streets of beasts. He heard the prayers offered for the hunters' safety and success. He felt that he was making a real difference, that his work mattered, that every beast he killed was one less threat to innocent people. And in a sense, he was right. The beasts were dangerous, did kill people, did need to be stopped. But Ludwig never quite grasped that the beasts wouldn't exist at all if not for the very institution he served. The church encouraged Ludwig's idealism because it served their purposes perfectly. They gave him resources, authority, respect, everything he needed to build the hunting organization he envisioned. They praised his honor and his skill. They held him up as an example of what devotion to the church could achieve. And all the while, they were using him and his hunters to clean up the mess the church itself had created, to eliminate the evidence of their failed experiments, to kill the people who had trusted the church enough to accept blood ministration and been transformed into monsters as a reward for that trust. Ludwig's weapon, the Holy Moonlight Sword, deserves special mention. This was not a trick weapon in the traditional sense. It was something else entirely, a blade that seemed to channel moonlight itself, that glowed with an ethereal pale light. Some claim the weapon was a gift from the Great Ones, others that Ludwig had discovered it in the depths of the labyrinths beneath Yarnam. Regardless of its origin, the sword became synonymous with Ludwig himself, a symbol of his pure intentions and his unwavering faith. But even Ludwig, for all his strength and skill and conviction, could not escape the blood's corrupting influence forever. He received blood ministration like all the hunters, indeed probably more than most, believing it necessary to give him the strength to face the terrible things he hunted. The church encouraged this, even mandated it in some cases. Hunters needed to be strong, fast, resilient beyond normal human limits, and the blood provided all of that. At first, the effects enhanced Ludwig's abilities without obvious negative consequences. He became faster, stronger, more durable. He could take injuries that would kill normal people and keep fighting. He could track beasts by scent alone, could move through darkness with perfect confidence. He was in every measurable way the perfect hunter, everything the church had hoped to create when they established their workshop. But the transformation was coming for him too. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, inexorably. Ludwig began to hear things, voices that others couldn't hear. He would sometimes lose time finding himself in places without memory of how he got there. His behavior became more erratic, more aggressive. His fellow hunters started to worry about him, though none dared speak those worries aloud. How could you question Ludwig? How could you suggest that the first hunter, the church's greatest champion, might be succumbing to the very curse he dedicated his life to fighting? Years passed, and Ludwig continued his work even as the signs of transformation became more obvious. His posture changed. He walked slightly hunched, as though his body was forgetting how to stand upright. His features coarsened, his teeth became more prominent. He refused to look in mirrors, refused to acknowledge what was happening to him. he poured himself even more deeply into hunting, as if by killing enough beasts he could somehow forestall his own transformation, could prove that his faith and honour made him immune to the blood's curse. But faith and honour mean nothing to the old blood. It transforms everyone it touches, eventually. The only question is what form that transformation takes. And for Ludwig, who'd received so much blood over so many years, who'd infused himself so thoroughly with the substance he thought would give him the strength to save others, the transformation was particularly terrible. Eventually, inevitably, Ludwig became what he had spent his life fighting. The details of his final transformation are lost to time, hidden behind church propaganda and the chaos of the night of the hunt. But at some point, the first hunter of the church became a beast, and not just any beast. He became something massive and terrible, something that retained just enough intelligence to use weapons, that could still wield his beloved holy moonlight sword even after his mind had been mostly consumed by bestial hunger and rage. The church sealed Ludwig away in the depths beneath Yarnam, in the nightmare labyrinths that existed somewhere between dream and reality. They couldn't kill him, couldn't destroy the legend they had built around him, even as they destroyed the man himself. So they hid him, locked him away where no one would see what had become of their greatest champion. And there he remained, decades or perhaps centuries later, still clutching his sword, still remembering fragments of who he had been, still trying in his broken way to be a hunter, even though he had become the thing he had once hunted. The tragedy of Ludwig is that he did everything right according to the church's teachings, and it damned him anyway. He was honourable, skilled, devoted, everything a hunter was supposed to be. He genuinely wanted to help people, to protect them from the beast threat. He believed in the church's mission completely, never questioned the blood ministration he received, never doubted that his work was righteous. And that faith, that devotion, that unquestioning obedience to an institution that was using him, destroyed him more completely than any beast could have. But even in his destruction, Ludwig served the church's purposes. His legacy lived on in the countless hunters who modelled themselves after him, who tried to live up to his example of honourable hunting. The story the church told about Ludwig, carefully edited to remove the inconvenient ending, inspired generations of young men and women to take up arms against the beasts, to serve the church's interests while believing they were serving humanity's survival. The holy moonlight sword, lost when Ludwig transformed and sealed away with him in his nightmare prison, became a legend in itself. Hunters spoke of it in reverent tones, describing it as the ultimate weapon, the blade that embodied everything hunting should be. That the sword's creator and wielder had transformed into a hideous beast monster was conveniently omitted from these stories. The church built legends on corpses and used those legends to recruit more corpses. A cycle that continued as long as there were people desperate or idealistic enough to believe that hunting was noble work done by honourable people for righteous causes. Gearman, watching all of this from his first workshop in whatever strange prison he'd been trapped in by forces we'll discuss later, must have recognised the perversion of everything he had tried to teach. He'd created hunting as a necessity, a grim duty that someone had to perform but that shouldn't be celebrated or glorified. The church had transformed it into something else entirely, into a performance, a spectacle, a way to channel violence into service of their own interests while making those who performed that violence believe they were heroes, and all the while the beast plague continued to spread. because no amount of hunting could eliminate a problem that the church itself perpetuated with every blood ministration they performed, with every dose of old blood they transfused into trusting patients. The hunters were fighting a war they could never win, because the enemy they fought was constantly being replenished by the very institution they served. It was madness disguised as strategy, self-sabotage presented as necessary defense, and it would continue until the entire city drowned in blood and beasts and fire. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before the church's final collapse, before the nightmare fully consumed Yarnam, there were other events, other factions within the church itself that we need to understand. Because the healing church was not a monolithic entity. It was composed of different groups with different goals, different philosophies, different visions of what humanity should become through contact with the old blood and the great ones. And the conflicts between these factions would prove almost as destructive as the beast plague itself. Before we continue deeper into the labyrinthine history of the healing church and its various factions, let me pause for just a moment. We're about halfway through this dark tale, and I hope you're finding it as fascinating as I do. The story of the healing church is one of the most intricate and disturbing narratives in all of gaming. A gothic horror epic that reveals new layers of tragedy the deeper you dig. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Bloodborne's lore, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button. It helps other people discover these videos, other folks who might be settling in for the night and looking for something to listen to as they drift off. And if you want more content like this, more long-form explorations of the dark stories hidden in the games we love, please consider subscribing to Nightfall Lore. There are so many more tales to tell, so many more dark corners of fictional worlds to explore together. Let's talk about the choir. Chapter 6. The choir. If the mainstream healing church represented the application of the old blood to medicine and the masses, then the choir represented its application to something far more ambitious and dangerous. The choir was an elite faction within the church, composed of scholars and researchers who positioned themselves as the true inheritors of Byrgenwerth's legacy. They wore uniforms directly modelled on student attire from Byrgenwerth, decorated themselves with symbols that echoed Master Willem's teachings, and claimed to be pursuing the path to transcendence through insight rather than merely physical transformation. But where Willem had warned against the old blood, the choir sought to combine his philosophy of mental spiritual ascension with the church's use of blood. They wanted to have it both ways, to use the blood to enhance their perception, while using enhanced perception to understand the blood and the great ones more deeply. It was a synthesis that sounded elegant in theory but proved nightmarish in practice. The choir established itself in the Upper Cathedral Ward, the highest district in Yarnam, both literally and figuratively. This area was accessible only to the church's elite, sealed off from the common people by massive doors that required special keys to open. Within these elevated halls, the choir conducted research that the general public never saw, experiments that would have horrified even those who'd accepted blood ministration as normal medical practice. The choir's great discovery, the find that defined their faction and shaped their entire approach to research, came from the depths beneath Yarnam. In the labyrinths that honeycombed the earth, in a vast cavern flooded with strange fluids and decorated with impossible architecture, they found something extraordinary. They found a great one, alive and accessible, something they called Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos. Ebrietas was unlike anything they had encountered, Before, she was massive, her body a strange fusion of dragon-like features and something that might have been tentacles or wings or possibly both. She appeared docile, or at least not immediately hostile, which was remarkable given what the scholars knew about Great Ones from their expeditions into the labyrinths. Most of the cosmic entities they had encountered were either completely incomprehensible or actively dangerous. But Ebrietas seemed almost approachable, as if she wanted contact with humanity, or at least tolerated their presence. The choir became utterly obsessed with Ebrietas. Here, finally, was a great one they could study directly, could communicate with, or try to, could use as a living laboratory for understanding the cosmic forces they sought to harness. They built their entire research program around her, conducted countless experiments trying to understand how she existed, what powers she possessed, how they might use her presence to achieve their goals of human transcendence. One of the first practical applications of their research with Ebrietas was the creation of something called choir tools. These were items and weapons that seemed to channel cosmic power directly, creating effects that went far beyond anything normal blood ministration could achieve. The most famous of these was a Call Beyond, a tool that could summon what appeared to be multiple exploding stars, tiny supernovas that could obliterate anything caught in their radius. Where did this power come from? From Ebrietas, from their research with her, from knowledge pulled from the living Great One they kept imprisoned in the depths. Because make no mistake, despite all their high-minded talk about communion and understanding, the choir was essentially keeping Ebrietas prisoner. She was trapped in that cavern beneath the upper cathedral ward, accessible only through a hidden elevator that descended into the flooded depths. Whether she could have left if she wanted to, whether she even understood she was a prisoner, whether she remained there voluntarily or through coercion, these questions troubled the choir not at all. They had a Great One in their custody, and they were going to use her for all she was worth. The choir's experiments extended far beyond just studying Ebrietas directly. They were trying to replicate what they believed Master Willem had achieved with Rom, trying to transform humans into beings with cosmic perception, with eyes on the inside that could see truths hidden from normal vision. But their methods were far more brutal than Willem's had been, and far more likely to fail in catastrophic ways. They established something called the Research Hall, a facility hidden away in a nightmare realm, accessible only through obscure means. Here, the choir brought patients, people who had come seeking healing or enlightenment, and they performed experiments on these poor souls that can only be described as torture disguised as research. They tried to force these people's heads to grow, to expand, to accommodate more brain matter, more eyes, more capacity for perception. They exposed them to cosmic forces that human minds were not meant to comprehend. They pushed and pushed, trying to create artificial Great Ones, or at least beings that could perceive and understand the Great Ones. Most of these experiments failed. The research hall was filled with failures, people whose heads had grown grotesquely large, but who had gained no actual insight, only agony and confusion. They shuffled through the halls, moaning and whimpering, barely aware of their surroundings, living evidence of the choir's complete disregard for human suffering in pursuit of their research goals. Some patients had their heads enlarged so much that they could no longer support them properly, had to crawl or drag themselves around. Others developed eyes in their heads that could see things but couldn't process what they saw, driving them into catatonic states of overwhelming sensory input. The few successes the choir achieved were almost worse than the failures. Sometimes, very rarely, a patient would undergo a successful transformation into something called a celestial kin or celestial being. These were creatures that had transcended humanity entirely, had become something more closely related to the Great Ones than to the species they had been born into. They appeared as semi-transparent, vaguely humanoid forms made of what looked like solidified starlight or cosmic energy. They possessed powers that defied natural law, could manipulate space and time in limited ways, could communicate in languages that hurt to hear. But these celestial kin, while technically successful transformations, weren't really people anymore. Whatever consciousness they possessed was so alien, so removed from human thought, that communication was basically impossible. They couldn't remember their former lives, couldn't tell the choir what they were experiencing, couldn't provide any useful information about what it was like to exist as a being of cosmic awareness. They were living proof that the choir's goal was achievable, but also that achieving it meant destroying everything that made someone human in the first place. The choir maintained a public face of respectability, of course. To the other members of the healing church, to the ordinary citizens of Yarnam who knew of their existence at all, they were simply the church's scholars, the intellectual wing of the institution. They presented papers on their research, carefully edited to remove any mention of the torture and failure. They provided services to the church, using their understanding of cosmic forces to develop new tools and techniques that could benefit the clergy. They maintained laboratories in the upper cathedral ward that looked clean and professional, that gave no hint of the horrors happening in the research hall or in the cavern where they kept Ebrietas chained. But within the church itself, the choir was feared and respected in equal measure. Everyone knew they were pursuing something dangerous, that their research pushed boundaries that maybe shouldn't be pushed. But everyone also knew that the choir had access to power beyond what normal blood ministration could provide, that they had achieved a level of understanding about the Great Ones that no other faction could match. And in an institution built on the pursuit of transcendence at any cost, that kind of power commanded respect regardless of what atrocities it required to obtain. The relationship between the choir and the beasts is worth noting. While the mainstream church and the hunters were focused on the beast plague, the choir seemed almost dismissive of it. In their view, becoming a beast was a failure of ambition, a transformation backward into something primitive rather than forward into something cosmic. Their experiments were aimed at the opposite direction, at making humans more like Great Ones rather than more like animals. They saw the beast plague as evidence that the church's approach to blood ministration was flawed. That simple transfusion without understanding was bound to cause problems. If only people would pursue cosmic insight instead of physical enhancement, the choir argued, there would be no beast plague at all. This conveniently ignored that the choir's own experiments produced results that were just as horrific as beast transformation, just in different ways. A person transformed into a mindless beast could at least be put down relatively easily, could be hunted and killed. But a person transformed into a celestial kin existed in a state that wasn't quite life and wasn't quite death, was something so alien that even ending their existence seemed impossible. And the failures in the research hall, the poor souls with grotesquely enlarged heads and minds full of horrors they couldn't process, they couldn't even die properly, couldn't escape the prison of their transformed bodies. Despite all their power, all their knowledge, all their success at achieving transformations beyond what anyone else in the church had managed, the choir ultimately failed at their true goal. They never managed to replicate what Master Willem had achieved with Rom, never created a being that could hide truths from the world the way Rom hid the presence of great ones from normal perception. They never achieved their own ascension, never transformed themselves into the cosmic beings they hoped to become. They remained human, obsessed humans conducting inhuman research, always reaching for transcendence but never quite grasping it. And when the nightmare finally consumed Yarnam, when the blood moon rose and the barriers between reality and dream collapsed, the upper cathedral ward fell with everything else. Ebrietas remained in her flooded cavern, still alive, still waiting, possibly mourning losses that humans couldn't understand in ways that humans couldn't perceive. The research hall continued to exist in its nightmare prison, its patients still suffering, still moaning, still trapped in bodies that had been transformed into prisons far worse than any cell. And the members of the choir themselves, those who hadn't already succumbed to beast transformation or worse, faced the consequences of a lifetime spent pursuing knowledge that humans were not meant to have. But the choir wasn't the only faction within the healing church pursuing dangerous research. There was another group, even more ambitious and even more mad, that took the church's research in a different direction entirely. They didn't want to transform individuals into great ones. They wanted to make contact with great ones directly, to communicate with them, to draw their attention and power into the waking world. They called themselves the School of Mensis, and their experiments would prove even more catastrophic than anything the choir ever attempted. Chapter 7: The School of Mensis. Where the choir at least maintained a veneer of scientific methodology and ethical consideration in their research, the School of Mensis abandoned all such pretenses from the start. This faction of the healing church, led by a man named Mikolas, who served as host of the nightmare, represents the absolute extreme of what happens when ambition is completely unchecked by wisdom, morality, or even basic common sense. The School of Mensis established itself in Yharnam, the unseen village, a hidden district of Yarnam that existed somewhat outside normal space and time. Yharnam was a place of dark rituals and darker architecture, where the buildings themselves seemed wrong somehow, their angles not quite matching up with Euclidean geometry, their shadows falling in directions that light shouldn't cast them. It was the perfect location for a group that intended to literally tear holes in reality. Mikolas's philosophy was simple in its audacity. If the Great Ones existed on a higher plane of existence, then why wait for transcendence? Why spend decades or centuries trying to evolve humanity to a point where it could naturally perceive and interact with these cosmic beings? Why not simply force contact, reach up from humanity's lowly position, and drag one of these great ones down to where humans could interact with it directly? The School of Mensis began preparing what they called the Mensis Ritual, an attempt to make contact with a specific Great One associated with something called the Nightmare. They weren't entirely clear on what the Nightmare was, whether it was another dimension, a shared dream state, or something else entirely. But they knew that Great Ones existed there, and they believed that by performing the right ritual, using the right sacrifice, they could pierce the veil between the waking world and the nightmare, could establish communication with these entities. To power their ritual, they needed an enormous amount of blood. Not just any blood, but blood infused with a specific quality. Blood from people who'd been thoroughly saturated with the old blood through repeated ministrations. They needed a population of subjects who'd been transformed by the blood to just the right degree, people whose very essence had been so thoroughly mixed with the cosmic substance that they could serve as a kind of battery for the ritual. The School of Mensis found these subjects all over Yarnam. They kidnapped them in the night, or convinced them to come willingly with promises of transcendence, or simply bought them from the church's own ranks, from among those who were showing signs of transformation but hadn't yet become full beasts. These people were brought to Yahargul, to chambers deep beneath the streets, where they were used in ways that can only be described as human sacrifice on a massive scale. But the School of Mensis didn't just kill these people and use their blood. That would have been too simple, too wasteful. Instead, they kept them alive in a state somewhere between life and death, their bodies suspended in strange apparatus, their blood constantly flowing through tubes and channels carved into the stone itself. The victims were conscious through this, at least initially, aware of what was happening to them but unable to resist, to escape, or even to die properly. Their screams and pleas powered the ritual as much as their blood did, or so the School of Mensis believed. Suffering, they theorized, opened doorways that mere death could not. The Mensis ritual took years to prepare. Mikolash and his followers worked tirelessly, refining their techniques, capturing more subjects, carving more symbols into the stone of Yahargul, pushing the boundaries of what was possible through sheer force of will and complete disregard for any ethical considerations. They tested and adjusted, making small contact with the nightmare, getting glimpses of what lay beyond, learning the names and nature of the beings they sought to reach. Their primary target was something called Murgo, or more accurately Murgo's wet nurse. Murgo was apparently the child of a Great One, possibly the child of the moon presence itself, though the details are obscure and contradictory. What's clear is that Murgo existed in the nightmare, was somehow important to the cosmic order, and that making contact with this entity would grant the School of Mensis the knowledge and power they sought. And they succeeded. Against all reasonable expectations, Mikolash and his School of Mensis actually accomplished what they set out to do. They performed their ritual, and they made contact with the nightmare. The barrier between the waking world and that other realm grew thin above Yahargul, thin enough that things could pass through, that communication could occur, that the School of Mensis could finally speak with the Great Ones they had pursued for so long. But success brought consequences they hadn't anticipated. The nightmare didn't passively allow contact. It responded, reached back, grabbed hold of everything the School of Mensis had offered it, and pulled. Mikolash and his entire school were drawn into the nightmare bodily, physically transported into that other realm, even as their bodies remained in Yahargul, creating a strange state where they existed in two places simultaneously. They became part of the nightmare, trapped within it, unable to escape even as they achieved the contact with Murgo they had sought. In the nightmare, Mikolash became the host, a title that suggested he was both prisoner and warden, both victim and celebrant of the ritual that had trapped him. He wandered the nightmare halls of his school, pursued by various creatures, occasionally lucid enough to ramble about eyes on the inside and the cosmos and the knowledge he had gained. He had achieved exactly what he wanted, had made direct contact with a Great One and gained cosmic insight beyond what any human should possess, and it had driven him completely, irretrievably mad. The physical remains of the School of Mensis in Yahargul were even more horrifying. The ritual had succeeded so well that the nightmare had begun to bleed through into the waking world. The district itself became unstable, existing partially in reality and partially in the nightmare. Time flowed strangely there. Dead things didn't stay dead properly. The victims of the ritual, those people whose blood and suffering had powered it, remained suspended in their apparatus, but were no longer quite human, transformed into something that existed between states, neither alive nor dead nor anything that had a proper name. And above Yahargul, visible only to those with sufficient insight to perceive it, there formed something that came to be known as the brain of Mensis. This was an enormous mass of brain tissue, a collective consciousness of some kind, possibly formed from all the victims of the ritual, or possibly something that had come through from the nightmare, or possibly both. It radiated madness, literally drove people insane just by existing in their perception. Those with enough insight to see it found their minds fraying, found thoughts that weren't their own intruding into their consciousness, found the boundaries between their individual identity and this vast cosmic consciousness beginning to blur. The brain of Mensis was perhaps the school's greatest success and their most terrible failure simultaneously. They had wanted to bring cosmic consciousness into the waking world, to create a bridge between humanity and the Great Ones, and they had succeeded. The brain was exactly that bridge, a physical manifestation of cosmic awareness existing in real space. But it was useless, possibly even harmful to the school's stated goals. It couldn't communicate in any meaningful way. It couldn't share knowledge or grant transcendence to those who encountered it. It could only drive people mad, could only destroy the minds of anyone who came into contact with it, including the very scholars who had created it. The rivalry between the School of Mensis and the choir deserves mention here. These two factions represented different approaches to the same goal, and they despised each other with the particular intensity that only similar groups can achieve. The choir looked down on Mensis as reckless madmen who pursued power without understanding, who would destroy everything in their quest for knowledge that they had no capacity to properly use. The School of Mensis viewed the choir as cowards and pretenders, as people who claimed to seek transcendence but weren't willing to take the risks necessary to achieve it, who kept their research confined to safe boundaries and thus would never achieve anything truly revolutionary. Both groups were right about each other, and both were catastrophically wrong about themselves. The choir's careful, methodical approach to understanding the Great Ones produced results that were just as horrific as anything Mensis created, just in different ways. And Mensis's reckless ambition had indeed achieved breakthrough contact with the cosmic realm, but at the cost of trapping themselves in nightmare and driving themselves insane. Neither faction could claim moral high ground. Neither could point to the other's failures without acknowledging their own. They were two sides of the same terrible coin, different expressions of the same fundamental corruption that had consumed the healing church from within. The influence of both factions extended beyond their immediate experiments. Techniques developed by the School of Mensis found their way into the broader church, ways of using blood and suffering to achieve specific effects that the mainstream clergy adopted without fully understanding their origins. Knowledge gained by the choir about cosmic forces was shared with other parts of the church, used to develop new treatments and new weapons without acknowledging the torture that has been required to gain that knowledge. The church as a whole became complicit in the crimes of its most extreme factions, normalizing horrors and incorporating them into standard practice. And through it all, through the rivalry and the research and the countless victims ground up in their experiments, both the choir and the School of Mensis believed they were doing important work, they convinced themselves that the ends justified the means, that the suffering they caused was acceptable because it advanced human understanding, that the knowledge they gained was worth any price in human lives and human sanity. They were scientists, they told themselves, researchers pushing boundaries that needed to be pushed. They were visionaries, seeing possibilities that others couldn't imagine. They were the future of humanity, the vanguard of a new age where humans would transcend their limitations and join the great ones in cosmic awareness. They were monsters, but they were monsters who wore the robes of healers, who spoke in the language of enlightenment, who justified their atrocities with appeals to progress and discovery, and that, perhaps more than any specific crime they committed, reveals the true horror of what the healing church had become. It wasn't just an institution that caused harm, it was an institution that had convinced itself that causing harm was virtuous, that torture was research, that destroying people's humanity was actually elevating them to something better. The School of Mensis and the choir represent the inevitable endpoint of the path Laurence had started down when he first defied Master Willem and brought the old blood to Yarnam. They are what happens when the pursuit of transcendence becomes completely divorced from any consideration of the cost, when ambition is allowed to run unchecked by wisdom or compassion, when an institution becomes so focused on its goals that it stops seeing the people it harms as people at all, only as resources to be used in pursuit of something greater. But even these factions, terrible as they were not the full extent of the healing church's corruption. There were other crimes, other conspiracies, other dark chapters in the church's history that we haven't yet discussed. One of those chapters involves a castle, a rival faction that practiced their own brand of blood sorcery, and a war that the church prosecuted with such thorough brutality that it makes everything else they did seem almost merciful by comparison. Let us turn our attention now to Cainhurst and to the war that the healing church waged to destroy them. Chapter 8. The War with Cainhurst. In the remote mountains beyond Yarnam, accessible only by carriage through treacherous passes, there stood a castle called Cainhurst. It was a place of Gothic elegance and aristocratic pride, home to a bloodline of nobles who traced their lineage back centuries. These nobles had their own relationship with blood, one that predated the healing church and existed completely outside its authority. They practiced what they called sanguine arts, blood magic that drew power from consuming blood rather than simply transfusing it. The people of Cainhurst, who had come to be known as vile bloods, discovered that by drinking blood they could achieve extraordinary things. They gained enhanced strength and speed, resistance to aging and disease, and various supernatural abilities that seemed to come from the blood itself. But unlike the healing church's approach, which distributed blood to the masses as medicine, the vile bloods hoarded their blood, kept it within their aristocratic lineage, used it to maintain their power and position over generations. The vile blood's blood came from a source different from the old blood the church used, or at least from a different aspect of it. They had their own connection to the Great Ones, their own covenant with cosmic forces that granted them power in exchange for devotion and sacrifice. The exact nature of this covenant is obscure, but it seemed to involve something called the Vile Blood Queen Annalise, an immortal monarch who ruled Cainhurst and who could grant the gifts of vile blood status to those she deemed worthy. For years, Cainhurst and the healing church existed in an uneasy balance, The church controlled Yarnam and had influence across the region, while Cainhurst remained isolated in its mountain fortress, conducting its own experiments with blood far from the church's oversight. There may have been some contact between them, some trade of information or resources, but for the most part, they operated in separate spheres. This changed when the church discovered that Cainhurst possessed something they desperately wanted. Some sources suggest it was a particular variety of blood that Cainhurst had access to, blood that came from Queen Annalise herself or from the Great One she was connected to. Others claim it was knowledge that Cainhurst possessed, forbidden texts or rituals that the church wanted to study. Still others believe the conflict was ideological, that the church couldn't tolerate the existence of a rival power that used blood in ways that challenged the church's theological authority. Regardless of the initial cause, the healing church declared Cainhurst heretical and declared war on the vile bloods. But they didn't send their hunters to fight this war. Hunters were for killing beasts, for managing the church's self-inflicted beast plague. For this campaign, they needed something different. They needed zealots, true believers who would prosecute this war with religious fervour rather than professional detachment. They needed the executioners. The executioners were a group founded by a man named Logarius, or Martyr Logarius, as he would later be known. Logarius was a devoted member of the church who believed utterly in its righteousness, and in the evil of anyone who opposed it. When the church identified Cainhurst as a threat, Logarius volunteered to lead a crusade against them, gathering followers who shared his zeal and his willingness to commit any atrocity in the church's name. The executioners armed themselves with enormous weapons designed for brutal execution rather than skilled combat. They wore gold-trimmed armour that marked them as elite warriors of the church. They trained relentlessly, preparing themselves for a campaign that would require them to storm a fortress and slaughter everyone inside, nobles and servants alike, anyone who carried vile blood in their veins or served those who did. When the executioners marched on Cainhurst, they brought with them the full support of the healing church. The church provided them with special blood that would enhance their strength and endurance. They gave them knowledge about Cainhurst's defences and weaknesses. They blessed their weapons with rituals meant to make them particularly effective against vile blood magic. This wasn't just a military campaign. It was a holy war, a crusade meant to purge heresy from the world. The battle for Cainhurst was brutal and one-sided. The vile bloods, for all their blood magic and supernatural abilities, were not warriors by training or inclination. They were aristocrats, scholars of their own brand of blood sorcery, not soldiers prepared to defend their home against a fanatical army. The executioners tore through Cainhurst's defences, killed everyone they encountered, and showed no mercy to anyone regardless of age or gender or willingness to surrender. The halls of Cainhurst ran with blood that night. Not the sacred old blood, but the ordinary blood of people being butchered by zealots who believed themselves righteous. The executioners worked methodically, clearing room by room, killing everyone they found. They destroyed Cainhurst's library, burned its research, shattered its artifacts. This wasn't just about eliminating a rival. It was about erasing every trace of Cainhurst's approach to blood magic, about making sure that their knowledge couldn't survive them. But the vile bloods weren't completely defenseless. The castle guards, wearing armour that seemed to be part of their very flesh, fought back with skill and ferocity. Some of the vile bloods themselves, particularly the Queen's knights, proved to be formidable opponents despite their lack of military training. The battle went on for hours, maybe days, the executioners gradually pushing deeper into the castle despite fierce resistance. Eventually, the executioners reached Queen Annalise herself. She was the heart of Cainhurst, the source of all, vile blood power, immortal and seemingly invincible. Ligarius personally confronted her, and a battle ensued that shook the very foundations of the castle. But even Ligarius, devoted as he was, even with all the power the healing church had granted him, could not kill Queen Annalise. She was truly immortal, could regenerate from any wound, could not be destroyed by any weapon he possessed. So Ligarius did the next best thing. He couldn't kill her, but he could seal her. Using rituals he had learned from the church, using the last of his strength and possibly his own life force, Ligarius bound Queen Annalise to her throne, trapped her in her own castle, rendered her unable to grant the gift of vile blood to anyone else. Then, his mission accomplished, he remained at Cainhurst as a self-appointed guardian, standing watch over the sealed queen, making sure that no one could ever free her and restart the vile bloodline. The healing church declared the campaign a success. Cainhurst was destroyed, its people exterminated, its knowledge erased. The threat of rival blood sorcery had been eliminated. The church's monopoly on blood-related practices was secure, and perhaps most importantly, whatever it was that Cainhurst possessed, whatever knowledge or blood or connection to great ones they had maintained, was now the church's to claim, to study, to incorporate into their own research. But as with everything the church did, the victory came with a cost that wasn't immediately apparent. Some of the executioners, in killing so many vile bloods, in being bathed in that blood during the battle, became infected with it themselves. They found themselves developing some of the same powers that the vile bloods had possessed, found their strength enhanced in ways that the church's blood ministration alone couldn't explain. They had become what they had tried to destroy, at least partially, carrying vile blood in their own veins even as they claimed to have purged it from the world. This created a crisis of conscience among the surviving executioners. How could they continue to serve the church as pure warriors against heresy when they themselves had been tainted by that heresy? Some tried to ignore it, suppressed any manifestation of vile blood powers, pretended nothing had changed. Others left the church entirely, unable to reconcile what they had become with what they believed. A few went mad, torn between their devotion to the church and the power they now carried that the church would consider evil. Ligarius himself remained at Cainhurst, watching over Queen Annalise's sealed form. Did he ever question whether the massacre had been justified? Did he wonder if there might have been another way, some solution that didn't require killing everyone in a castle, including people who had no involvement in whatever disputes the church had with Cainhurst rulers? If he harboured such doubts, he never expressed them. He stayed at his post, his armour gradually freezing over from the cold mountain winds, becoming a statue of devotion, a monument to what happens when faith becomes fanaticism. The destruction of Cainhurst sent a message throughout the region. This was what happened to those who opposed the healing church, who practiced blood magic outside the church's authority, who positioned themselves as rivals rather than subjects. It didn't matter how isolated you were, how powerful your magic, how noble your lineage. The church would find you, would destroy you, would erase you from history so thoroughly that future generations would barely remember you existed. But for all their thoroughness, For all the blood they spilled in Cainhurst halls, the executioners and the church that commanded them failed to completely erase the vile blood legacy. Queen Annalise remained, trapped but alive, waiting for someone who might eventually free her. The blood that had been spilled soaked into Cainhurst's stones left traces that could be found and studied by those who knew where to look, and the knowledge that the vile bloods had accumulated over generations, while mostly destroyed, hadn't been entirely eliminated. Fragments survived, hidden in places the executioners never found, waiting for someone curious or ambitious or foolish enough to seek them out. The Cainhurst campaign represents the church at perhaps its most nakedly brutal. There was no pretense here of helping people, no claim to be curing disease or preventing transformation. This was pure elimination of competition, the violent assertion of the church's monopoly on blood-related power, and the church prosecuted this war with the same zealotry and moral certainty they brought to everything else they did, convinced that their cause was righteous, that their enemies deserved extinction, that any amount of bloodshed was justified if it served the church's interests. And yet, for all the death and destruction, for all the lives ended and knowledge destroyed, the Cainhurst campaign accomplished nothing that truly mattered. It didn't make the church stronger or wiser. It didn't advance their understanding of the old blood or bring them closer to transcendence. It simply removed a rival, created more enemies, and added another layer of atrocity to the church's already blood-soaked history. It was violence for its own sake, disguised as holy war, and it revealed just how far the church had fallen from Laurence's original vision of healing and helping humanity. But even the Cainhurst massacre, terrible as it was, wasn't the darkest chapter in the healing church's history. There were secrets that ran deeper, crimes that made the executioner's crusade look like a tragic but understandable mistake. To find these secrets, we need to look beyond Yarnam itself, to experiments conducted in places most people don't even know exist, to atrocities committed in pursuit of knowledge that should never have been sought. We need to examine the research hall more closely, and we need to journey to a cursed fishing hamlet where the church committed a crime so terrible that it echoes through eternity itself. Chapter 9. The Church's Darkest Secrets. We've discussed the research hall briefly in the context of the choir's experiments, but the full scope of what happened there deserves closer examination. This facility, existing in a nightmare realm, accessible only through specific means, represented the absolute nadir of the healing church's research ethics. If ethics is even the right word to use for an institution that had long since abandoned any pretense of caring about the suffering it caused. The research hall was established by the church, likely overseen primarily by the choir, as a place where they could conduct experiments too extreme even for the secret laboratories in the upper cathedral ward. They needed a place where screams wouldn't be heard, where failures could be hidden away, where they could push the boundaries of what could be done to human subjects without worrying about witnesses or consequences. The patients brought to the research hall were not willing participants in research. They were victims, people who had been promised cures or enlightenment, who had trusted the healing church and been betrayed in the most complete way possible. The church told them they would be helped, that the procedures being performed would advance their spiritual growth or cure their ailments. Instead, they were transformed into grotesque parodies of humanity, their bodies and minds warped beyond recognition in pursuit of data the church could use to refine their understanding of blood and cosmic forces. The primary goal of the research hall experiments was to create beings with enhanced insight, with eyes on the inside that could perceive truths hidden from normal human perception. The church believed that by forcing a person's head to grow, by physically expanding their skull and brain, they could create more space for eyes to develop, for cosmic perception to emerge. This belief was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how insight actually worked, treating it as a purely physical phenomenon when it was actually something far more complex and spiritual. The procedures used to force this growth were agonizing. Patients were subjected to treatments that caused their heads to swell grotesquely, their skulls expanding in ways that human bone was never meant to move. Some patients' heads grew so large that their necks could no longer support them, leaving them unable to walk upright, reduced to crawling or dragging themselves around. The pain must have been excruciating, constant, overwhelming, made worse by the fact that the researchers didn't believe in wasting resources on pain management when the suffering itself might provide useful data. Most patients didn't develop any actual insight from these procedures. They simply became broken, their minds shattered by constant pain and the physical trauma of having their skulls forcibly expanded. They lost the ability to think clearly, to remember who they had been, to form coherent thoughts beyond simple pleas for mercy or death. They shuffled through the research hall moaning and crying, living evidence that the church's methods were fundamentally flawed, but too far gone to provide useful data about why. A few patients did develop what appeared to be insight, but it didn't help them. Enhanced perception without the spiritual development to handle it drove them mad even faster than the physical trauma did. They saw things that human minds weren't equipped to process, cosmic truths that shattered their sanity, layers of reality that were better left hidden. They would scream about what they saw, babble incoherently about colours that didn't exist and sounds that came from nowhere, until eventually their minds collapsed entirely and they became catatonic, trapped in bodies that wouldn't die, even though the person who had inhabited them was already gone. The staff of the research hall, the doctors and researchers who conducted these experiments showed no signs of moral crisis over what they were doing. They documented everything meticulously, wrote detailed reports about each patient's symptoms and responses, discussed their findings in the dry clinical language of scientific research. They had convinced themselves that this was important work, that the suffering they caused was regrettable but necessary, that the knowledge they gained justified any amount of human misery. They were, in their own minds, heroes of science, pushing boundaries that needed to be pushed for the advancement of human understanding. But the research hall wasn't even the darkest chapter in the church's history. That distinction belongs to what happened in a place called the Fishing Hamlet, an event so terrible that the church tried to erase it from history entirely, an atrocity so complete that it created its own nightmare realm where the victims could continue suffering long after their physical bodies had died. The Fishing Hamlet was a remote coastal village, home to a small population of people who made their living from the sea. They were simple folk, not particularly connected to Yarnam or the church, living their lives in relative isolation. But the people of the hamlet had discovered something extraordinary. In the waters near their village they had found what appeared to be a great one, a cosmic entity that had either died or was sleeping or existed in some state between life and death. They called it Kos, or some say Cosm, and they revered it as a deity. The hamlet's relationship with Kos was different from the church's relationship with the Great Ones. The villagers didn't try to experiment on Kos, didn't try to extract her blood or use her for research. They simply honoured her, incorporated her into their religious practices, and in return they gained certain gifts. Some developed strange physical traits, mutations that marked them as blessed by Kos. They found that the water near Kos had healing properties that certain parasites that grew on her body could be used as medicine. That prayer to Kos brought comfort and occasionally miraculous intervention in their lives. When the healing church learned about the Fishing Hamlet and the Great One they possessed, they couldn't allow it to remain unmolested. Here was a Great One that was apparently accessible, vulnerable, possibly even harvestable. The church needed to study Kos, needed to claim whatever power she possessed, needed to ensure that no one outside the church's authority had access to a Great One. And if the villagers objected, well, the church had already demonstrated at Cainhurst what happened to those who stood in their way. The church sent an expedition to the Fishing Hamlet, likely composed of members from multiple factions including the choir and possibly some hunters for security. Among them was Lady Maria, Gehrman's student, one of the most skilled hunters in Yarnam. What happened next is not entirely clear from the historical record, but the outcome is undeniable. The church slaughtered everyone in the Fishing Hamlet, killed every man, woman and child in the village, then experimented on their corpses in ways that were horrifying even by the church's standards. But they didn't stop with the villagers. They also attacked Kos herself, this Great One who had been sleeping or dying or existing in whatever state cosmic entities exist in when they're not actively manifest. They cut into her, harvested her organs and blood, studied her body with the same clinical detachment they brought to all their experiments, and in doing so they committed what might be considered deicide, the killing or desecration of a god, an act so terrible that it created consequences that would haunt the church forever. Some of the villagers, at the time of the church's attack, had been pregnant with children that appeared to be partly human and partly something else, offspring that carried traits from Kos herself. The church didn't spare these people. They killed the pregnant women, harvested the fetuses, studied them as they had studied the adults. One of these orphaned children, these beings that were part human and part Great One, became known as the Orphan of Kos, and his rage at what had been done would eventually create a nightmare that trapped all those involved in the massacre. Lady Maria participated in this atrocity. Exactly what role she played is unclear, whether she killed villagers herself or simply provided security while others conducted the experiments or something in between. But she was there, she witnessed it, and what she saw destroyed something fundamental in her. Maria was a skilled hunter, had killed beasts and monsters without apparent crisis of conscience. But what happened in the Fishing Hamlet was different. These weren't beasts, they were people, innocent people, whose only crime was living in a village that happened to be near a Great One the church wanted to study. After the Fishing Hamlet, Maria left, hunting entirely. She threw her weapon, the rakuyo, down a well and refused to ever touch it again. She took a position at the research hall, possibly hoping to do some good there, to help the patients who were being experimented on. But the research hall was its own nightmare, and whatever good intentions Maria had couldn't change what that place was or what was done there. Eventually Maria died, though whether through suicide or other means remains unclear. Her spirit remained at the research hall, guarding the entrance to the deeper secrets, trying in death to prevent others from discovering the full extent of the church's crimes. The Orphan of Kos, that being that was part human and part Great One, created a nightmare realm that trapped the souls of everyone involved in the Fishing Hamlet massacre. This wasn't a normal dream or a simple haunting. It was an entire reality, constructed from the orphan's rage and sorrow, where the victims of the massacre continued to exist in tormented form, and where those who had participated in the massacre were forced to relive their crimes eternally. The orphan himself existed in this nightmare, still crying for its mother, still mourning the loss of Kos and the slaughter of the hamlet's people, unable to rest until some form of justice or closure could be achieved. The Fishing Hamlet massacre represents the absolute extreme of the healing church's corruption. This wasn't about helping people or preventing the beast plague or advancing human transcendence. This was pure exploitation, the violent theft of power from people and beings who had done nothing to deserve it. The church saw an opportunity to claim a Great One, and they took it, murdering anyone who stood in their way, desecrating a cosmic being, creating suffering on such a massive scale that it literally broke reality and created a nightmare dimension where that suffering could continue indefinitely. And the church tried to hide it all. They erased the Fishing Hamlet from their records, destroyed evidence of the expedition, ensured that those who participated never spoke of what they had done. They turned the hamlet's location into a secret, transformed the event into something that only the highest echelons of the church knew about. They built layer upon layer of obfuscation and misdirection, making sure that if anyone did stumble upon hints of what had happened, they would never be able to piece together the full truth. But secrets like that cannot remain buried forever. The nightmare created by the Orphan of Kos existed as a permanent accusation, a place where the truth of what the church had done was preserved in horrible detail. Those with sufficient insight could sense it, could feel the weight of that crime pressing down on reality like a tumor. And eventually, someone would find their way to that nightmare, would face the Orphan of Kos, would have to reckon with the full extent of the atrocity the healing church had committed. The research hall and the Fishing Hamlet together reveal what the healing church had truly become by the height of its power. Not a religious institution, not a medical organisation, not even a research facility in any honest sense. It was a machine for processing people into knowledge, for transforming human bodies and souls into data points that could be used to advance the church's understanding of blood and cosmic forces. Every person who came to the church seeking help was potentially a subject for experimentation, a resource to be used up in pursuit of goals they could never understand. And through it all, the church maintained its facade of benevolence. They still provided blood ministration to the public, still presented themselves as healers and spiritual guides. The average citizen of Yarnam knew nothing about the research hall or the Fishing Hamlet. They saw the church as their protectors, the institution that saved them from disease and defended them from beasts. The truth, the full horrifying truth of what the church did behind closed doors, was hidden so effectively that most people lived their entire lives without suspecting it. But lies that large cannot be maintained indefinitely. Eventually, inevitably, the weight of the church's crimes would bring everything crashing down. The blood they had distributed so widely would transform too many people into beasts for even the hunters to manage. The cosmic forces they had so recklessly contacted would reach back, continue 09-12, would pull Yarnam into a nightmare from which there was no waking, And Laurence himself, the first vicar who had started this entire catastrophe, would face the ultimate consequence of his defiance of Master Willem's warning. He would become the very thing he had spent his life trying to prevent and cure. He would become the most terrible beast of all. Chapter 10: The Fall of Laurence and the Church's Collapse. For years, decades, possibly centuries, Laurence presided over the healing church as its first vicar. He oversaw its expansion from a small group of scholars distributing a miracle cure to an institution that controlled every aspect of life in Yarnam. He watched as the church's influence spread beyond the city, as its fame attracted pilgrims from across the continent, as its power became so absolute that no one could imagine Yarnam without it. He saw all of this, and he must have believed he'd been proven right. Master Willem had warned him to fear the old blood, but look at all the good it had done. Look at all the people it had helped. Look at this glorious institution that had been built on its power. But the signs of disaster were there if anyone cared to look. The beast plague was getting worse, not better, despite all the hunters and all the knights of the hunt. More and more people were transforming, the changes happening faster, the transformations becoming more extreme. The blood ministration that had once seemed like a pure good was revealing itself to be a time-delayed poison, something that cured your immediate ailments but doomed you to eventual transformation into something monstrous. The various factions within the church were also tearing the institution apart from within. The choir pursued their cosmic research, the School of Mensis performed their reckless rituals, the executioners carved their bloody path through Cainhurst, and all of them were pulling in different directions, pursuing different goals, fighting over resources and authority. The unity that Laurence had tried to build was fracturing, revealing that the church had never truly been one organisation, but rather multiple groups bound together only by their shared access to the old blood. And Laurence himself was transforming. He tried to hide it, tried to suppress the signs, but they were undeniable. He was becoming a beast. Slowly but inexorably, the blood he had taken into his own body over so many years finally overwhelming his humanity. His mind remained sharp, his leadership skills intact, but his body was betraying him, fur growing beneath his robes, his posture becoming more hunched, his appetite shifting toward meat and blood in ways that were impossible to ignore. The exact moment when Laurence transformed completely is lost to history. Perhaps it happened gradually, his humanity slipping away piece by piece until one day he could no longer pretend to be human. Perhaps it happened all at once, a sudden catastrophic transformation that took him from first vicar to rampaging beast in moments. Either way, the result was the same. Laurence, the man who had brought the old blood to Yarnam, who had founded the healing church, who had defied Master Willem's warnings and insisted that he could control the blood's power, became the thing he feared most. But Laurence didn't become just any beast. He became the cleric beast, the first and perhaps most terrible example of what happened when members of the clergy transformed. Cleric beasts were massive, far larger than normal beast transformations, their bodies twisted into forms that combined bestial features with strange horns and growths that suggested something cosmic in their corruption. They were strong enough to tear buildings apart, fast enough to catch anyone who ran, and driven by a hunger that could never be satisfied. Laurence's transformation into a cleric beast must have been catastrophic for the church. Their leader, the man they had followed for so long, revealed as susceptible to the very plague they had been fighting. How could they maintain their authority when their own first vicar had become a beast? How could they continue to distribute blood ministration when the man who had begun the practice had been destroyed by it? The revelation must have shattered what remained of the church's credibility, at least, among those who knew the truth. The church tried to contain the situation. They couldn't kill Laurence, couldn't destroy the founder of their institution, even in his transformed state. So they sealed him away, trapped him in a location where he couldn't harm anyone but couldn't die either. They erased him from the official histories, stopped mentioning his name, transformed him from a revered founder into a shameful secret. New vicars took his place, continued his work, maintained the church's operations, but none of them could truly fill the void Laurence's transformation had created. And as Laurence fell, so too did the church itself begin its final collapse. The beast plague accelerated, transforming more people faster than the hunters could eliminate them. The various factions within the church turned on each other more openly, fighting for control of a sinking ship. The research programs that had produced such terrible fruits began to fall apart as the nightmares they had created started to bleed through into reality more obviously. The barriers between the waking world and the nightmare realms grew thin. The Mensis ritual had accomplished this partially, but other factors contributed as well. All the blood the church had distributed, all the cosmic contact they had made, all the suffering they had caused, it added up to a kind of critical mass that bent reality itself. The Great Ones, who'd been content to exist in their distant realms for millennia, suddenly found themselves able to reach into the waking world more directly, to influence events, to draw people into dreams and nightmares from which there was no escape. One Great One in particular took an interest in Yarnam. The Moon Presence, a being of immense power and unknowable motivation, reached down from its cosmic realm and began to manipulate events in the city. It may have been the same entity that the School of Mensis had contacted, or it may have been drawn by their ritual. Either way, the Moon Presence wanted something in Yarnam, something to do with Murgo and the Nightmare Child, something that required the intervention of hunters who existed partially outside normal reality. The Moon Presence made contact with German, the first hunter who had trained so many others in his workshop. It offered him a deal, or perhaps forced him into one. German would create a place called the Hunter's Dream, a realm that existed outside normal time and space, where hunters could be trained and resurrected, where they could pursue beasts and other prey eternally without permanent death. In exchange, German would remain in this dream, trapped there, overseeing it forever or until the Moon Presence's goals were achieved. German accepted, though whether willingly or through coercion remains unclear. The Hunter's Dream was created, and into it came hunters who had died during the night of the hunt. Hunters who had been on the verge of death. Hunters who had somehow been selected by the Moon Presence for its purposes. These hunters existed in a strange state, neither quite alive nor quite dead, able to die repeatedly in the waking world but always returning to the dream, forced to hunt until they either fulfilled whatever purpose the Moon Presence had for them, or went completely mad. The Healing Church, what remained of it, had no idea how to respond to any of this. Their understanding of the Old Blood and the Great Ones, for all their research and experimentation, was fundamentally incomplete. They had unleashed forces they couldn't control, contacted beings they couldn't understand, created problems they had no idea how to solve. All their confidence, all their certainty that they were elevating humanity toward transcendence had been revealed as hubris. The final collapse came during what would be remembered as the longest night of the hunt. The blood moon rose over Yarnam, turning the sky a sickly red, making the barriers between reality and nightmare paper thin. Beasts poured into the streets in numbers that overwhelmed even the mass-produced church hunters. The common people locked themselves in their homes and prayed, hoped that somehow they would survive until morning. But morning didn't come. The night stretched on, hours becoming days, reality itself seeming to hold its breath as everything the church had built finally fell apart. Throughout the city, church members transformed into beasts. The clergy, who had received the most blood ministration, were particularly susceptible. They became cleric beasts, massive and terrible, smashing through the very churches they had once presided over. The streets ran with blood as hunters fought beasts, as beasts fought each other, as the entire social order of Yarnam dissolved into chaos and violence. The choir, locked in their upper cathedral ward, found their research coming back to destroy them. The celestial kin they had created turned hostile or simply indifferent to their creator's suffering. Ebrietas, the great one they had imprisoned and studied, remained in her cavern, possibly mourning, possibly indifferent, certainly not helping the people who had tormented her for so long. The School of Mensis had already been consumed by their own success, trapped in the nightmare they'd created. But that nightmare was now bleeding through more obviously into the waking world, the brain of Mensis radiating madness across wider areas, the Mensis ritual having achieved contact with forces that were now pulling Yarnam itself into their realm. And in the depths beneath the city, in the endless labyrinths where it all began, ancient things stirred. The Thumerians, long dead but not quite gone, reacted to all the old blood being spilled above them. The great ones in the deeper depths became more active. The entire foundation beneath Yarnam, both literal and metaphorical, proved to be unstable, rotten, unable to support the weight of the city above it. The healing church, as an institution, effectively ended during that eternal night. Oh, there were probably survivors, probably members of the clergy who made it through, who might have tried to rebuild or reorganize. But the church's authority was gone, its power broken, its reputation destroyed. Everyone could see now what the church had always been. Not healers, but plague spreaders. Not protectors, but predators. Not a path to transcendence, but a road to transformation into mindless beasts. And through all of this, somewhere in the ruins, Laurence's skull remained. His human skull, separated somehow from the beast he had become, preserved as a relic of what he had been before the blood consumed him. In that skull was preserved a memory, that final conversation with Master Willem by the lake at Byrgenwerth. "Fear the old blood," Willem had said, and Laurence had promised he wouldn't forget. But he had forgotten, or had convinced himself that his fear was unfounded, that he could control what Willem had warned him against, and that forgetting had doomed him, had doomed his church, had doomed everyone who had ever trusted either of them. The fall of the healing church was not just the collapse of an institution, it was the failure of an entire philosophical approach to the old blood and the great ones. Laurence had believed that by studying these forces, by distributing their power widely, by pushing humanity toward transcendence through physical transformation, he could elevate human civilization to something greater. But he'd been wrong on a fundamental level. The Great Ones were not tools to be used or paths to be followed. They were forces beyond human comprehension, and attempting to harness them could only end in destruction. Master Willem sitting alone at Byrgenwerth with Rom hiding in the lake, had been right all along, and Laurence, in his transformation into a beast, in his final fate as a shambling horror that had lost everything that made him human, proved it in the most terrible way possible. The old blood should have been feared, the great ones should have been left alone, and humanity's reach for transcendence should have been tempered by wisdom, by caution, by some recognition that not all boundaries should be crossed simply because crossing them is possible. But wisdom came too late, if it came at all. The healing church fell, Yarnam fell with it, and what remained was a nightmare city where hunters pursued beasts through eternal night, where the living envied the dead, where the promise of healing had transformed into the reality of endless horror. Conclusion. As we come to the end of our journey through the history of the healing church, we're left with a story that is as much tragedy as it is horror. This wasn't a case of evil people doing evil things, at least not at the beginning. Laurence genuinely wanted to help people. The early church truly did cure diseases and ease suffering. Even the later factions like the Choir and the School of Mensis believed they were advancing human understanding, pushing toward a future where humanity could transcend its limitations. But good intentions are not enough. The road to hell is paved with them, as the saying goes, and the healing church walked that road all the way to its destination without ever recognizing where they were headed. They convinced themselves that their goals justified their methods, that the suffering they caused was acceptable because it served a greater purpose, that the ends they sought were so important that any means of achieving them were permissible. This is the true horror of the healing church, not the beasts they created, not the nightmares they unleashed, not even the specific atrocities they committed in places like the Fishing Hamlet or the Research Hall. The true horror is how ordinary people who thought of themselves as good, as righteous, as servants of humanity's betterment, could do such terrible things and never question whether they had become the very evil they claimed to fight. The church's story is a warning about institutional corruption, about what happens when an organization becomes so focused on maintaining and expanding its power that it loses sight of its original purpose. It's a warning about the dangers of ideology that places abstract goals above the welfare of actual people. It's a warning about research conducted without ethics, about the pursuit of knowledge without wisdom, about ambition unchecked by humility. It's also a warning about the specific danger of seeking transcendence, of trying to force humanity to evolve beyond its current state. There's an arrogance in that ambition, a fundamental belief that what we are is not good enough, that we need to become something more. The healing church looked at humanity and saw something broken that needed fixing, something limited that needed expansion, something lowly that needed elevation. And in trying to fix and expand and elevate, they destroyed what was valuable about being human in the first place, the ability to choose, to feel genuine emotions, to exist as individuals rather than as components of some grand cosmic plan. Master Willem's alternative approach, focusing on insight rather than blood, wasn't necessarily better. His experiments produced their own failures, their own suffering. But at least Willem recognized the danger in what he was doing. At least he warned against the blood. At least he tried to proceed with some caution. Laurence and his church had no such restraint. They charged forward convinced of their righteousness, and that conviction blinded them to the harm they were causing until it was far too late to stop. The beasts that filled Yharnam's streets were not separate from the church. They were the church's true creation, the inevitable result of distributing the old blood so widely. Every person who transformed into a beast was someone the church had treated, someone they had given blood ministration to, someone they had promised to help. The church created the beast plague, and then they positioned themselves as the solution to that plague, and somehow no one in authority ever stopped to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this solution was to stop distributing the substance that was causing the problem in the first place. But they couldn't stop. The church was addicted to the blood as much as any of the patients who received it. The blood gave them power, gave them authority, gave them the ability to perform miracles that kept people loyal and dependent. Stopping blood ministration would have meant admitting the church had been wrong, had been causing harm, had been the source of the very plague they claimed to fight. And institutions, especially powerful ones, rarely admit such fundamental failures. They double down instead, create more elaborate justifications, build more layers of bureaucracy to hide the truth from themselves as much as from others. The various factions within the church, the choir, the School of Mensis, the executioners, the hunters, they all represented different aspects of this same fundamental corruption. They were all convinced of their righteousness, all pursuing goals they believed were important, all willing to cause immense suffering if it meant advancing their agenda. And they were all wrong, all lost, all contributing to the nightmare that eventually consumed them. In the end, what remained of the healing church was scattered survivors living among ruins, trying to maintain some semblance of their former authority over a city that had descended into chaos. The Grand Cathedral still stood, but they were empty of worshippers, haunted by the ghosts of those the church had destroyed. The blood ministration that had once seemed miraculous was now recognized as poison. The hunters who had been heroic protectors were revealed as janitors cleaning up the church's mess. Everything the church had built, everything they had claimed to represent, was shown to be a lie. If there's a lesson to be drawn from the healing church's history, it's this. Be very careful who you trust with your body, your health, your life. Institutions that claim to have your best interests at heart may be more interested in serving their own agenda. Treatments that seem miraculous may have costs that won't become apparent until it's too late. And authority figures who speak with absolute certainty about complex issues are often the most dangerous people of all, because they've convinced themselves that their confidence makes them right, that their good intentions excuse any harm they cause, that their vision of the future is more important than the suffering they create in the present. The healing church began with Laurence wanting to cure his sister Melania. No, wait, that's the wrong story. Laurence wanted to cure people, to ease suffering, to bring the benefits of the old blood to humanity. And he ended as a beast, mindless and terrible, everything he feared most about the blood fully manifested in his own transformed body. That transformation is poetic justice of the cruelest kind, the fitting end to a man who ignored every warning, who broke with his mentor, who built an empire on a substance he never truly understood. And maybe, just maybe, that's what needed to happen. Maybe Laurence needed to become a beast to prove definitively that Master Willem had been right all along. Maybe the healing church needed to fall so completely that no one would ever make the same mistakes again. Maybe Yarnam needed to be consumed by nightmare so that other cities, other civilizations, would learn from its example and choose a different path. Or maybe there's no lesson, no silver lining, no redemptive purpose to any of this. Maybe it's just tragedy all the way down. A story about people who tried to play God and discovered that gods are neither kind nor controllable. A cautionary tale about reaching for transcendence and finding only transformation into something monstrous. Maybe the Healing Church's history teaches us nothing except that humans are capable of unimaginable cruelty when they convince themselves that cruelty serves a higher purpose. Either way, the Church is gone now, fallen, destroyed by the weight of its own accumulated sins. Its grand buildings remain, monuments to folly and hubris. Its victims remain, whether as beasts prowling the streets or as tortured souls trapped in nightmare realms. And somewhere, in whatever passes for an afterlife in Bloodborne's dark universe, Laurence and Willem might finally be having the conversation they should have had before any of this began, about fear and blood and the terrible price of defying wisdom in pursuit of ambition. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the darkest chapters in gaming's history. The Healing Church's story is intricate, disturbing, and endlessly fascinating. A gothic horror epic that reveals new depths the more closely you examine it. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to Nightfall Lore. There are so many more dark tales to explore, so many more nightmare worlds to examine, so many more cautionary stories about ambition and corruption, and the things we become when we reach too far. Until next time, rest well and remember, when someone offers you a miracle cure, when an institution promises to solve all your problems, when those in authority assure you they know what's best, maybe, just maybe, you should fear the old blood, fear what they're offering, fear the price that will eventually come due. Because in Yarnam, and perhaps in our own world too, the cost of salvation is always higher than anyone admits until the bill arrives, and there's no way left to pay except with your very humanity. Sleep well, and may you find your worth in the waking world.